Welcome to another CO2 Monday. I'm your host, Trevor Matthews. And this week, I thought I'd do a special week because this is actually week number 26. So for the last 26 weeks, we've been talking CO2, having some of the top experts from around the world, from on this planet, talking about CO2. And I thought it'd be a good time to reflect on the last 25 weeks, talk about the different guests, talk about some of the things they talked about. We'll do some Q&A here because this is a live audience, which I really appreciate all the support, all the emails I'm getting from everyone, and really enjoying this because I've been enjoying this journey. This has been a journey for the last 25 weeks. I've learned so much on CO2, and I feel like I'm just getting started. Trying to invest in myself, in the community, CO2 community around the world. And I want to thank all the supporters there. I really appreciate that. All the podcast supporters, because it's really important. As we work together, we grow together. And this is why I do this week in, week out. But I thought it would be good to really dive into some of the topics and the guests that we had on and go through it. If you have any questions on it, please shoot them in the chat, unmute yourself. We can have a conversation about it. That's what it's all about. That's what CO2 Monday is all about, is learning a little bit, having a conversation, getting to know the experts, because it's so important to have that opportunity to either ask questions, reach out to them, because it's new. It's still new to all of us. It might have been around for over 100 years, CO2, but it's still growing. It's new. You've seen the manufacturers we talk to. We see all the technicians we talk to. Like, things are changing rapidly with CO2, which I really like. And I think it's changing the refrigeration industry. It's helping improve it. It's making our industry better. And lots of people, CO2 is not going to last, this and that. I've heard many things. It's a high pressure, blah, blah, this, blah, blah, that. No. It's making our industry better because people are starting to look, well, I need to do this right. Yes, there's higher pressures. There's safety factors now. I got complacent for so long working on standard HFC systems or synthetic systems now that I got to really get back into it and start learning how to do it proper again. There's lots of people, don't get me wrong, are doing it right from day one, but there's so many people we need to train. We all know that globally, we don't have a lot of technicians in the field. We need more and more. And the knowledge in there is not continuing to grow because technology is changing at a rapid pace. All of you are on here because you want to learn. You want to invest in yourself. And you're listening to this because you know that it's changing really fast. And it's hard to keep up. To be honest, it's hard to keep up because we have so much going on in our industry. And we'll even talk about even in CO2. From the experts we talk to, there's so much differences between the different applications. There's a lot to learn. It doesn't happen overnight, this learning. And this is why I'm really excited about doing this. And this is why I continue to do it, because we are a global community. And the more that we work together, the more that we share the knowledge, it's all going to make us better. And I really think CO2 is really helping the industry because I see it. The technicians I talk to, they talk about how they do it differently now. Not only because of the higher pressures, is because they understand that with CO2, it could be more costly to the job if you make a mistake. It could, parts, for an example, you're using all electronics now than mechanical devices. Well, now you need to understand that. So they're taking more of the time to learn that stuff, where it's like, I know how a TXV works on a standard system, but just because you know how one TEV works or TXV, whatever you call it, doesn't mean they all work the same. Internal equalizer, external equalizer, and that's no different with electronics. But now they're starting to learn the individual electronics, which is great because there's lots of different TXVs and they work differently. So now with the electronics, so they're learning each one. So Danfoss, Krell, Sporlin, Emerson, which is great. You got to understand each component that you're working on. And in CO2, I see more and more of these technicians spending the time to learn it because they don't know. And it makes me happy that I see that. And I talk to them, I get to know them, and they're developing their skills. And so over the last 25 weeks, we had a lot of different guests. And I'm going to share my screen so we can go through some of them. We might not be able to get through all of them today. Maybe we will. But I'd like to talk about some of the things I learned And if you guys want to leave something in the chat, if you want to unmute and talk about that topic that day, what you got out of it, of any of them, please let me know. Let's have a conversation about it, because I might have missed some stuff. I've watched all these a second time. Like I've watched all of them, maybe some of them maybe 3 or 4 times, because from editing them, getting them on YouTube, getting them onto the podcast. So I've been listening to them and watching them and writing all this stuff, but there's still lots of things that I've missed. Maybe never haven't read between the lines too, because there's a lot of information in a lot of these sessions. So I'm just gonna share my screen with the people that are on the live Zoom chat, and then I'll talk it through with anybody that's on the podcast. So the very first episode I did was just introducing CO2 Mondays. This here was the second one was with a good friend of mine, James Bailey's from Omega Solutions. Now, James is a rock star in the engineering side. He really understands the design of refrigeration system, and that's what he does. He's a consultant with his company. He owned a really big engineering firm, sold it off. Now is doing lots of training, mentoring. But we got into a CO2 system, and we really talked about the impact of CO2 onto the planet, into the climate. We talked about the advantages and disadvantages of CO2, the fundamentals. So we started brushing into it, and that's the way I wanted to do. I kind of wanted to ease into CO2 topic, just to understand some of the safeties and stuff. And that was podcast episode 5. So if you want to go back and listen to that and talk about, listen to a little bit about the design and engineering side, really that was a good episode there, and it really kicked it off quite well for me. From there, we went into really a mentor of mine, Andre Patnode from Emerson. I've learned so much from Andre in CO2 over the last, I'm still learning from him, over the last 6-7 years. He taught a lot of what I know. A lot of knowledge I know he taught me, because we spent the time together, we worked together, we trained together, we build programs together. And in this session, I thought it was a perfect gentleman to have for this session, was high ambient strategies. Because he dove right in, he knows these ones inside and out. And it was really good to learn the different high ambient strategies that are out there. Because before, say 10-15 years ago, all of them weren't there. Like we didn't have gas and vapor ejectors. We did, you know what I mean? Maybe parallel compression was there. There's adiabatic solutions, but it wasn't really something that is available today where you can jump onto it and really see those, because they're coming on OEM equipment now. Mike, do you have a question? You can jump out if you do. But I learned a lot just from when we talked about, why adiabatic solutions are really good in certain parts of the world, but it's not really effective in other parts of the world, right? If it's very humid, adiabatic solutions aren't really going to work. Can they? They still can, because there is a lot of sensors in there where we'll measure the humidity outside, and it'll do a bunch of different measurements and say, okay, now we can use adiabatic solutions depending on that ambient zone. So it's taking your wet bulb, dry bulb, it's understanding what is going on in the ambient, and then it can say activate adiabatic solutions or not. But this was really good, as if you're a designer, if you're a technician, really to understand the differences on these high ambient solutions or warm ambient strategies. It could be called a lot of different things. And it's really to get you out of that transcritical zone if you don't want to be there. Because sometimes you want to be in the transcritical zone. Right? You want to be there because maybe you're doing heat reclaim or recovery or defrosting. So there's reasons why you might want to be running in transcritical. And we learned that from Andre, and what was really good. So if you want to jump on podcast episode 7, that's where you're going to learn a lot. Like I took a lot of notes there, and I went through it with him for many years before even this talk, but I thought it was really good for everyone to really understand those different solutions. Then we dove into servicing and repair CO2 system with Brett Wetzel. Brett's an expert in refrigeration. He has the Advanced Refrigeration podcast, and it was really good to have him on here because he talks with a lot of techs in the company he works for about CO2, and his co-host, Kevin Compass, has installed has worked on, commissioned, startup over, I think he said 120, 90 to 120 stores. I can't remember. I did a podcast with him, or a CO2 Monday with him, but we dove into a lot of different things, and he showed us some pictures like the rack piping. There's a lot to a CO2 system. There's a lot more piping to it. But what's great about it, even if you look at this picture, there's a lot of arrows on it. And a lot of the racks that I worked on, even installed, there was no arrows on the piping. So this is kind of the improvements OEMs are making and adding, or contractors adding, to help the technicians out there, which I think is really good. That really gives a good advantage of understanding the system. Because when I can see where the flow is going and understand that, it clears up a lot of things. So as a technician, listening to that, understanding that. Then we do even think the relief valve station. I might have heard of that before, but I've never seen one. And he showed us a picture of that just to talk about the different types of reliefs you can have on a system, because there's a lot. I was at a site maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, I can't remember now, where I walked on, and there's actually a relief header. You don't see this in a standard system. There's actually a relief header where all the potential places that you could have high pressure in, so you don't trap gas, for your low pressure side or your high pressure side, depending on the level of the relief, like the pressure relief that you're looking for, it goes into this header. So there's lots of different types of relief. So you need to understand that stuff. And we dove into some of the servicing things on not only transcritical system, we talked about pump systems there. We also talked about cascade system on that episode. So episode 9, I learned a lot from that one. And is another guy that you can reach out to. He's huge on social media. You can hit him up and Facebook, shoot him a message, and he will get back to you for sure. On podcast episode 11, I had Phil Boudreau from Bitzer, and I thought this was a really good one because I'm still learning a lot about Bitzer. My background is on Copeland compressors, and I was learning about Tecumseh and Danfoss and Bitzer and Doreen and all those other compressor manufacturers. But there's a lot more on the CO2 sides that I didn't know about. And I know Bitzer is one of the biggest players in North America right now, or is the biggest player for CO2 that I know of. And we just dove in and we were talking about the different things that you'd see on the Bitzer compressors, right? From having the IQ modules to the different types of superheat that they're looking for the Bitzer compressors. And I got even into drives. We were talking about the drives that go on to the Bitzer compressors. And he said that in Europe right now, they have matching drives for their CO2 compressors, which are, I believe, coming to North America if they're not already here, which is something that is good to know about. This is something you want to start researching and learning more, because even these manufacturers, they're still developing. They're still working on their products. They're trying to make them better. They're trying to really help the industry grow. And I really enjoyed this one because I've learned a lot on it. And I even went back into the manual on the Bitzer manuals and found a few more things that I learned. So Phil is a great guy, very smart in CO2 and compressor technologies. And I always like, as you guys see, I don't only have manufacturers, I have contractors, consultants, engineers coming on here, business owners, because I think the industry is so big and there's just so many thought leaders in our industry. I think we need to have a combined effort. We all need to be working together to get better, like I said before. And I had Mike Harding from Gateway, and this was a great episode. Mike is one of the smartest technicians I know out there, and he dove in because he really learns the topics. So even in refrigeration, I talked about it, he would dive in deep, and that's what technicians need to do. That's a real technician. When he doesn't know something, he'll dive in deeper to try to find the answer. And that's really what we got into and we talked about when we were getting into system commissioning and services. We got into electronic valves. He was even talking about, well, like he had CO2 valves, and it's still so new, is that some of the manufacturers didn't even have like their capacity charts yet. So you can run into these issues in the field because the technology is coming out and it's newer. So he had to reach out to the manufacturer to find that stuff out. And these are the things that you need to do. You need to be very, what's the word I'm trying to say? You need to think outside the box sometimes, because sometimes you can't find that information. So what do you have to do? Well, you can rely on the information you have, assess it, and then work on finding the rest of the information like he did. He said he went to the manufacturers, he worked with them, and they worked through the issues to get the problem solved, which was really cool. And I had a good time on that. I've listened to that a few times because it is helping me with even my service thought, commissioning thoughts, because it takes a long time to learn refrigeration. And then when you add CO2, the complexity of it, it's important to take the time. And Mike was a great guest on that. Okay, on April 25th, Wayne Grunwald. When I first met him about 2 years ago, he is so passionate about CO2 and he really understands it. He'll talk about it like he's been in CO2 his whole career in refrigeration, and he's a consultant, he's a trainer, he's such a good trainer, and he works with some of the largest manufacturers around the world on CO2, helps guide them, consults for them, because he really wants to make a difference, and we spent the time on this one. We dove into chillers quite a bit on there, and he was talking about the different ways they work, how the heat transfers, and the importance of using and transferring that heat to make your systems more efficient. He talked about if you can use more applications in that one system, you're going to be more efficient. So what do I mean by that? You're doing refrigeration, you're doing heating, you're doing air conditioning, all that different stuff that we talked about. And I learned a lot. I've been learning a lot from him. And that 1 hour session, I've learned even a couple more things, even after talking with him for many hours. So that was episode 15. And I think you'll definitely enjoy that because he has so many good design criteria. I even have him on a second time that we'll talk about the software that he uses for designing the systems. But I learned a lot. And this is why I bring these guests, these top guests, because they are the experts in the field. And I think it's important that you guys know who they are, because maybe you need some more help on the design or the engineering side. I think it's very crucial to work with the consultants, the engineers, the manufacturers to find out more about their product, right? Because they want to help. I've met many people, they're not helpful. They don't want to help. Yeah, well, maybe that one person at that manufacturer doesn't want to help. It doesn't mean the other 200 people don't want to help, because they want, any company there's people that's not going to want to help. I'm too busy, I'm too busy, I'm too busy. You're only busy if you want to be busy. And a lot of the manufacturers I work with, there are so many people that are passionate, just like me, that want to help you as a technician, engineer, end user, whatever you are, to get better. So you understand their product and their solutions a bit better. Oh, this was a great one with Lars from Advancer. So if you haven't listened to this one, you need to get on this one. This was podcast episode 17. Lars is such a stand-up guy. He is a true expert and a true trainer. He loves sharing his knowledge. And this is where we dove into really troubleshooting the gas cooler. We dove into the gas cooler, understanding why that sensor is so important, how it's set up, how it's working. And I always enjoy talking. I talk to Lars quite often. I'm on a lot of his trainings, learning from him, trying to get better, trying to grow my knowledge. And when we first met, I actually met online. We haven't met in person, but I met him last year, maybe, or year before last. But I was on his first training last September or October, I think it was, Advancer training. And we just sat and talked. And even afterwards, I reached back out to him and we talked more, and he wants to share CO2 knowledge. He wants to help the industry. And in this one, we dove into training on CO2, and head to Advancer. They do trainings all the time. I highly recommend, if you can go over there and go to some of their 2-day seminars, you should. The more training you get, the better. You're gonna grow. It doesn't matter, I took a CO2 training before, I don't need another one. Yes, you do. You need to learn from different people, because everyone has their own way of explaining CO2, the way it works. They get different technologies, so I highly recommend it. This was a great episode. Podcast 19. Now, this is an awesome guy, Benoit Rodier. I met him personally back in June at Atmosphere America event, and he's just a stand-up guy. This guy is a gentleman. He understands CO2 refrigeration like anyone wants to. Like he knows it inside out. And every time I talk to him and ask him a question about CO2, he understands the question I'm asking and can give me an answer back that, a lot of times blows me away. We got into why you want to understand, like consultants and you need to know CO2 refrigeration. And we really dove in like to the different designs and how they can be more efficient, and talking about how to design systems in a different way than it was done previously. Oh, let's just oversize the condenser, for this one day a year. And he really made me think about that and talk to other people about, what was it? The diversity factor, I think he said, of that when you're sizing a CO2 system. Think about the diversity factor. And this is what you need to do. If you're an engineer or designer, you want to understand that. Like, okay, well, if I'm sizing it for one day a year, what about the other 300 and some days a year? Because this is the way the industry's changing. We're learning, we're growing. And this was a great episode 19 with Benoit. I highly recommend listening to that. That's another one I listened to a bunch of times, and it's so good I had him on a second time, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. Episode 21. I learned a lot from Kevin. I'm always learning from Kevin Compass. Like, he's the other half of Advanced Refrigeration Podcast, and such a smart technician. He knows his stuff. He knows CO2 refrigeration inside out. I don't know how many other guys have worked on over 100 CO2 systems in North America. So he's probably one of the top CO2 commercial CO2 guys commissioning. He must be, if he's not the top guy. And we got into fine tuning CO2 system, which is so important. And I even had talks in some of the talks with the manufacturers about how it's so important to keep that flash tank stability, right? How to make sure that your suction's running. And this is no different in any other systems, like synthetic systems. You just have more to watch in CO2. And we were diving into different things, like the difference of fine tuning a standard synthetic or HFC rack to a CO2 transcritical booster rack. And some of the issues you could see with a flash tank receiver, and the things that you want to look for when you have an oil management issues, if you have high pressure oil issues, sizing. I think, what else? There's so much, I can't even remember it all. I'm sure some of you can even remember it. Like how often you should change your oil filter, I think we dove into as well. There's lots of different things that we talked about, but it's important to really understand that not only after you commission a CO2 system, you have to go and continue to fine tune it. And you can't just do it all at the same time. You have to do it, like he said, you have to do it in steps. You have to get your flash tank good. If you don't have your flash tank good, you can't just go start fine tuning your electronic valves and your cases and your case controllers. So there is a process. And talking about the defrost strategies, like we dove in deep on that stuff because it's very important. Because if you don't have your defrost set up, you're going to run the risk of either freezing up cases, not having enough load, if you get other preheated water or other heating applications in that system. So there's so many different things to talk about. So it was a step-by-step process in how to fine tune a rack. And I thought that one's gold. That one's definitely, if you're a service technician or you're commissioning, installing system, you need to listen to that. And we only have 1 hour. Like I'm sure we could have talked for 10 hours about the different things he does. He has a whole podcast. So head to the Advanced Refrigeration Podcast. Go listen to that and see some of the different podcasts he talked about with CO2, because this is what it's important. Continue to grow your knowledge. I feel like I'm forgetting more than I'm learning, because this is week 26. So we did 25 weeks of talking about CO2. So there's a lot of information that we went through so far. Podcast 26, I had Andre Patno back again to talk about their transcritical CO2 compressors, because Copeland's really pushing real hard for CO2. Even when I was there, I know I've talked about with Andre, he was the global CO2 director back in 2014, and CO2 was not a big thing, especially in North America. It wasn't a big thing for Emerson. It's out there, the European team's doing it, but he pushed hard. And he pushed hard for years and years and years, talking CO2 internally. And then now it's like Emerson's like, now they're onto it. I see more and more, even since I left Emerson over a year ago now, I see they continue to grow their CO2 and their natural refrigerant space, which is good. This is great for the industry because it makes the manufacturers work harder on it. The more manufacturers that are building stuff, they want to have the best product. So that means they're developing, they got R&D teams making better product for us to train on, to service, to install. So I think it's a really good thing. Right, so this is what we dove into what their platforms they have. We talked about the new CO2 scroll, transcritical scroll, which I'm seeing more and more of on social media. Different manufacturers having it installed. I can't wait to see one. I can't wait to have one to take it apart and look inside to really understand it. And that's how I learn. I take components apart to understand, what is this? What does that do? Why does it do that? And this is why I train. I'm going to do a CO2 compressor masterclass, for example, and I talk about every component in there so you understand. When you understand every aspect of a component, if it's a high pressure valve, if it's a compressor, or whatever it is, if it's a valve, when you understand to the fundamental levels of what's inside it and how it works, you can troubleshoot really anything. Because then you know, okay, well, this is how it's supposed to work. This is everything inside that could make it work or not work. What's causing it not to work? So now you can think outside the box. You can theorize, and you can come up with some solutions to why something's not working. But a lot of times I see people don't know what they're working on. They don't understand what they're working. They don't understand the sequence of operation. And with CO2, you want to understand all that stuff. And not only CO2, everything that you work on, you should understand that stuff. But I truly believe you spend the time and you learn how each component works on any system, CO2 system, you're going to be a better technician. If you understand every component as a designer and engineer, you're going to make that system more efficient, because you're going to understand, okay, if I have this and this, it's going to make this happen, and that's what my customer is looking for. And so I'm really excited to learn more about the transcritical scroll. I'm going to try to get some manufacturers who have it installed in their system and talk about the DVI and really get into those ones. So that's coming soon. I'm going to find somebody who wants to come on and talk about that for sure. Okay, Patrick Clarity from Danfoss. This is podcast episode 28, and this was awesome. I learned so much from Patrick. We dove into the high pressure ejectors, low pressure ejectors, and this is coming. I'm talking to more and more people about ejectors. I didn't, like when I was training CO2, I didn't even hear of a setup or an installation in Canada or even North America with ejectors. Now I'm talking with lots of different people, and they say, yeah, I had a system with ejectors on it. So there's definitely multiple systems out there in Canada, in North America, that have ejectors. And he dove right into this, dove in deep to get a good understanding of what these ejectors do and how it makes the systems more efficient. Diving in, do you need a parallel compressor or do you not need a parallel compressor? And so it was really important to understand how they work. And when we went into Cool Selector 2, like that, if you do not have that downloaded on your computer, you need to download Cool Selector 2 because it has everything on Danfoss. And he went through to show you how to size a high pressure valve and a flash gas bypass valve, where all the resources are, and talked about it. So this was an episode that I learned a ton, because I talked about ejectors for a couple of years, but I didn't really know at that deep of level, and I've only seen one or two as a display before. So it just gave me a clarity of looking inside. They got some good YouTube videos as well, so you can head to YouTube and look up Danfoss ejectors to see what's inside. But what you need to understand if you're an engineer or a consultant is ejectors going to be relevant for my customer depending on where they're at in the world. That's what the first step. As a technician, you need to understand, how does this affect my system? I don't have a high pressure valve now. The ejectors are now the high pressure valve, or I do have a high pressure valve and I got an ejector. When is it ejecting and why? And now you need to understand this. You won't learn this in an hour session here with me or even with Patrick, because you got to go into those manuals. You got to read those manuals. You got to understand how it works. And even me, I'm still new to it. I still got to go back to the manuals. I'm going to have to read through it again, because I think it's important. We're going to see more and more of this stuff. And it just continues to evolve these high ambient strategies to make the system more efficient. Why I like it, and why I continue to love what all these different manufacturers are doing, is they're starting to push the limits for CO2 to be more competitive with synthetic refrigerants. And that's really what's happening. Before it was like, oh, CO2 is just so inefficient. It's such a high energy cost. But now we're seeing you have a full solution with CO2. Your energy is going way down and you're getting, like I said before, heating, air conditioning, and refrigeration. Like it's making a huge difference in the industry. So I really love that episode 28 with Patrick Clarity. Check that one out. The following week, I had Timo Kofold from Corel. Timo, he's just a true trainer. He really wants to help and educate the industry, his customers. We communicate back and forth quite often, and we dove into Corel's electronic valves. We talked about their CO2 valves because there's a lot of them out there, right? And we talked about their controllers. And what's really good to start to understand is like we dove into the troubleshooting side of electronic valves, and it's important to understand that stuff because there are uniquenesses depending on the type of valves. Because if you have a stepper valve or if you have a pulse width modulation valve, depending on the manufacturer, you need to understand how they work, and then you need to understand how that controller works. Because a lot of the time, I've seen this many, many times. I was even on a call just before this call talking about how technicians are out there troubleshooting systems and the controller doesn't have a screen on it, doesn't have any power to it. How can you troubleshoot a system when you do not know what's going on? And I've seen this many, many times, OEMs selling pieces of equipment without the faceplate on how to set up a controller. I've seen it so many times. So a technician goes there, is like, well, isn't that electronic controller already programmed? No, probably not. It's probably in the contract that the sales or project manager has, and it says up to contract to program. Seen it. And this is where we dove in and we talked about how to troubleshoot those electronic CO2 valves, how to look at the controllers, where to find that information. And I learned a ton. Once again, I'm learning every time I do these CO2 conversations, and I hope you are too, because they're very important to take the time to learn. And it's easier to learn them in 1 hour chunks each week than try to listen to 25, 26 hours in one go. It's all about this small, simple steps, learning little bits all the time. And this is what it's happening for me. I'm learning a little bit each time. Am I an expert? No, I don't say I'm an expert. I'm just learning a little more, and I'm getting better at CO2 refrigeration. I mean, a lot better, especially from these guests, as you can see so far. Podcast episode 33, Jake Henderson from Neyland's, like 27, and this guy knows refrigeration. He's only 27 years old, and he knows CO2 refrigeration than most mechanics in North America. Most mechanics, because we have tens and tens of thousands of mechanics. We have a very small population of CO2 refrigeration mechanics, a very small, and he understands CO2 refrigeration inside and out. We had a great time talking about his experience. He said he did 2 projects. He worked on 2 CO2 projects from start to finish, but inside this episode, I think I wrote 10 specific things that we talked about before you even get the equipment. What do you do? Special tools you need, breaking down like the pressure test, understanding the evacuation, charging the system. We really dove in deep, and he was very good at articulating what he was doing and getting his team to do to make sure that's a successful project from start to finish. And we dove into maintenance. Afterwards, I think after the first 3 months, we talked about even maybe the first year, a little bit of it's hazy, but he explains what he does. And this, if you're a technician listening out there, or if you're a service manager, if you have a team, you should be sharing that episode 33 to your team, because a lot of what he talked about can be used on other refrigeration systems, right? But we specifically talked about CO2, and he nailed it. Like, I learned a ton from him. And I was pretty happy about that. I'm going to have him on again for sure to talk about the rest of the CO2, because I know he's doing more and more projects, working on more and more of these systems. So episode 35, like I said, I had Benoit on previous, I think back in May, and then I had him on again because he just has so much knowledge. And this is what I'm trying to do, is get the knowledge from the experts to share with all of you. He has a ton of knowledge. And this is where we dove into direct and indirect systems, which I didn't really have a clue on. I understood glycol being pumped through the system, but I didn't understand the difference between indirect and direct, using glycol versus brine versus CO2. Like we dove in deep. Like I learned a ton about why you want to go with an indirect over a direct, and depending on the applications. And I actually seen a post on LinkedIn from one of his coworkers, David. I can't remember David's last name on the top of my head, but talking about I think it was the Columbus Blue Jackets. They added a CO2 indirect system because they had already all the equipment there. Even though they know direct is more efficient, it keeps that temperature more stable across that whole ice surface, but the customer, they understood the customer's needs. And what he did is they came up with a solution that was going to be perfect for the customer. Instead of saying, okay, let's rip all this out and let's go with a direct system, it's like, let's make this system, this work for the customers for their best possible solution. And that's what they did. And this was a great conversation because I learned a lot. I've listened to it multiple times. I'll listen to it again, and I bet you I'll learn more about it. Because we talked about why, like I said, why it's more efficient, the direct system, having what else did he talk about? A global solution approach. I think that's what Ben will call it. Or I think that's what it was. But yeah, global solutions approach, where you can do heating the stands, heating the crowd, heating water if you need it. So this is where CO2 is bringing us to, this global CO2 approach that Benoit said, which really it's something I never thought of before, but it really made me think that, okay, wow, this is impressive. Now we can start thinking differently than just refrigeration. Let's just make some ice. No, let's think about, what do we need for the stands? What do we need for the cafeteria? What do we need for the maintenance? Taking this global approach, and a huge amount of knowledge in there. Episode 35 with Benoit Rodier. I'm telling you, you're going to learn something. And all of these, I know a lot of you have been on here week over week. There's a few new names that I see up there. But you got to take notes on these ones. And if you're listening to on the podcast, sometimes you need to stop and write some notes. So if you're driving in your vehicle, I highly recommend when you stop, don't do it while you're driving, write down what you remembered from that podcast or that session. It's so important to start to journal this stuff down so you remember it, because I did 25 of these and I got piles of notes, and I still had to go back and listen to it to write some more notes, because I know I remember Benoit said that, and what was it again? Go back to the notes. So make sure, if you want to become better, start journaling some of this, taking notes about some of these conversations. Do you need to have all of the information? No, but there's one or two tips in each one of these that's going to help you become better with CO2 refrigeration, for sure, hands down. Episode 38 on the podcast, I had Nigel Burkett from Gateway. So I know Nigel for many, many years, worked together at Gateway a lifetime ago when I was first starting out as a first year apprentice, second year apprentice. And so we went through the trenches together and I learned so much from him, because it was like when I started out, it was like, okay, here's the keys, go do some service because we're short staffed. Here you do a couple of calls with a journeyman here and there, and that's just the way it was. And it's the way it is now. Make a phone call, go try to figure it out. And I learned a lot from Nigel just on jobs, just understanding what to do, what not to do, what works, what doesn't work. And he's been getting into CO2 refrigeration over the last couple of years. And actually just before this, he did a transcritical booster startup with his team. So he was out there learning more about it. So we dove into the do's and don'ts of what he's seen there, talking about when you get equipment from a manufacturer and there's missing parts on it, what do you do? How do you overcome those adversities? How do you work with the manufacturer to get the right solution to get your customer up and running? Because sometimes the contractor can't do much about it, because if they don't have the parts and the equipment and wasn't shipped with them, you got to figure that out. And it's really important to take the time to understand that, not get frustrated. You could cry and complain all the time, but that's not coming up with a solution. So you got to work with that OEM and your customers to get them up and running. Check out episode 38 and learn about Nigel's experience on starting up and commissioning a CO2 system. And once again, he was talking about how good the team worked together, how the team on the CO2 side worked together on getting the evacuation down, getting the pressure test, the commissioning, how they worked as a team to get it all functioning and running and working through those adversities when you don't have certain things. Episode 40. Now this was an awesome one. I learned so much on this one here. Ignacio Chaporro, spent some time. I met him in Washington as well at the Atmosphere America event or summit. And I knew I wanted to get him on here because he's an expert with CO2 and he's been training it for the last 5-6 years and has been in refrigeration for way longer than I have and just has that knowledge, you know. And we dove into their two cool technologies, the FTE, you know, they talked about the FTE tank and how it works and really give an understanding of that solution, that full transcritical efficiency solution. Now, once again, this is taking that standard booster system where everyone's like, oh, well, you're in transcritical, it's costing you so much money, where you add this technology to do it and you can get 10, 12, 14% more efficient when you're adding a solution like this. And what I thought was really cool, I think I remember him saying now, those evaporators, now they're more like a semi-flooded evaporator. So you're running at 1, 2, 3 degrees superheat, which is really cool because now you know that system, that case, that box is going to be running more efficient. We only have superheat to protect the compressor. But now that you can run at a lower superheat because you have this FTE tank, now that makes a huge difference. And this one, you want to dive into that because then you get into the extreme ETE. And now that's where instead of having mechanical subcooling, you're having a subcooler using that, I guess, using the CO2. So your system, instead of having that separate mechanical subcooler, it's all doing it in one system. Why not? What a great idea that is. You know what I mean? And then you can combine them together to even increase that efficiency. You know, I think he said for every increase in your suction temperature, maybe 1 degree, you know, you get 1.7 increase in your COP. I think it was something around that. That's huge. That's huge. So now if you can run those evaporators at a higher evap temperature to maintain that temperature of product, it's huge amount of efficiency. This one here, you need to dive into it. He said there's hundreds of systems globally. I think it was 500, 150. I think that the combination of them globally is 50, but it's going to continue to grow. I know this for sure. You want to understand, you want to dive into that episode 40. So get onto that and listen and find out. Next, Emmanuel Frochelet from Bach. So Bach is a compressor that I didn't know much about. I've heard about them once or twice before, but I didn't really know how much they were in CO2. It's a crazy amount that they're in CO2. We got into the Star compressor. They're huge in the transport industry, getting CO2 on trains, on buses. And we really dived into understanding what Bach is all about and understanding and he talked a lot about oil management, what's really good for me, talking about the viscosity of the oil and how that affects the compressor and understanding the discharge temperature and how that affects the viscosity. And we really dove in deep and talking about pump out rate. Like Manuel he's an expert at compressors and he's definitely an expert at CO2 compressors. This is one that you want to get in because we talk about the importance and the safety of CO2 and using those compressors and really taking the time to listen to these or watch these is gonna make you better. Once again, there was so many notes that I took in this session that I had to go back and make sure that I heard them correctly because he was just shooting out points all the time. There was different points that was coming out about Bach because they've been doing this for a long time. I think it's in the early 90s. They were working on compressors and CO2. Early to mid 90s. Lots of CO2 experience they have. So once again, check them out. Is this something that you're working on? If you're not working on, is it something you may see down the road? Oh, this was a great one. Damon Reed. So from Pro Refrigeration. So they made the first CO2 chiller for North America. They get the first, and they got a couple installed now. And Damon is just such a stand-up guy. He's a technician. He's a chief revenue officer now, but he's the trainer. He helps his team grow, get better. He helps his customers. And you see, he went through a presentation talking about the steps that he does with his customers, what you should be doing with your customers when you're commissioning a job. You know, walking them through the different steps, the planning, the preparation, the execution of those jobs with your customer, because this is so important. It doesn't matter if you're the sales, the project manager, the technician, the owner, you want to make sure your customer feels comfortable and confident with the equipment you're providing and servicing them. Because this is an example where Damon and his team are not there. They're not there because they have a subcontractor there. So he goes and trains the subcontractor to understand the technology they've never seen before. And that's so important. That's so important in our industry, to help one another. You know, help them grow, because it's only going to make our industry better. And we dove into a lot of great topics, talking about, he was showing, I think he's using a Danfoss controller, where now he can remotely monitor all his chillers, and he can take a look at it. I think they got another solution, Pro Chill maybe, or Pro Monitoring. I'll have to look that up. I don't remember. But now he can talk with the subcontractor, look at the points and say, are you seeing this? He also got into the safety aspect of how you should finish a job off. If you have a leak, like he fixed that leak on the high pressure side. We talked about it, and he was going through and he found it, had his gloves on, and he rubbed across it. Didn't cut off his fingers. So, you know, I've heard that before. Oh, well, you're gonna cut. Well, you have your proper safety gear on. You understand what you're looking at. You're going to be safe. You want to be safe. You don't want to get hurt. And this doesn't matter what industry you're in. If you're working on standard refrigeration, or if you're working on advanced CO2 refrigeration, you got to be safe, right? I really believe that. And we dove into his startup, his process on starting up one of the first CO2 transcritical chillers here in North America. There was so much good tips that he gave off. Then we got into back with Winan Grunwald from Future Green now. So this one was a really good one if you're a designer and engineer. We were getting into the software he uses, their engineering equation solver. You got to purchase that software. But if you're an engineer and you need to really understand the ins and outs of what that system is designed for, how to change it, manipulate it, it's a really good opportunity to learn. You know, I played around with it a little bit. I'm not an engineer, I'm not a designer. We dove into talking about how you can change the system from, you know, change the design aspect of the system to see how you can get the best COP out of that design. So if it's a heat pump, if it's a booster rack, and he really dove into the engineering side, talking about the pinch point, talking about a lot of different terms that, you know, I didn't talk about a lot more, but now I'm starting to hear more about them. The more I talk with people, that triggers me to, when someone says that, I'm like, wow, okay, I understand that, you know, and this is how I continue to learn. I write this stuff down, kind of take notes, review those notes later, and that really helps me grow. And this is another great one. Philip Walker. Oh, this was an awesome one from Arneg. So he's the director of refrigeration. I believe that's his title. And he's been in the industry, supermarket industry, I think he said over 20 years. And we really dove into that flash tank stability. So he had some slides up showing some 3D designs of him and his team, what they're working on, and how important it is to maintain a very good, stable flash tank. And I learned a ton about this. You know, you think, okay, well, all I'm going to do is, you know, I'm going to maintain that flash tank at so many pressure, so many bar, and this is what I got to do. There's way more to that. What happens when you have 7 pipes coming out of a flash tank? That's what we were talking about. What happens when you have 2 flash gas or 2 high pressure valves going into the flash tank? What do you do? How do you do it? And this is what's important, because these are the way technology is changing, adding stuff to make it more efficient for their customers or more reliable if something does happen. And we dove in real deep on the flash tank stability. I learned a ton. Like I said, you can go onto the YouTube channel and watch that. You're going to want to take notes, because as I talked about with Kevin Compass, who's a service technician and commission technician who's done hundreds or over 100 commissioning, he focused on that fast tank stability. He said that's one of the most important things. Then Philip comes on as the manufacturer and dives in even deeper to say how important that is. How important that is. So make sure to check that one out, because really it's another thing that you need to learn that's different from a standard refrigeration HFC or synthetic refrigerant. That's some of the two biggest things, or three. There's a couple of bigger things, but your high pressure valve, your flash tank bypass valve, and that flash tank receiver. You know, that's a big thing. Everything below that is just standard refrigeration, subcritical. And standard refrigeration. But above that, there's some different uniqueness that you need to understand. You need to understand. That's a great one that I learned a ton. I will watch that one again. And then I had Daniel Clark. I met Daniel through my friend James Bailey, and he owns a company, Isentra. Daniel, he's super smart. Like, this guy he is very keen on understanding the in-depths of CO2. And like he said on there, I believe he said he's like one of the first people from the UK, so in the early 2000s, who went to Denmark to learn about CO2 and bring it back to the UK. Now he built a company, a heat pump company as well. I think he might do chillers around that knowledge that they learned over the years, diving in and making the systems better, getting them bigger, providing a solution for their customers that they need, a unique solution. Because you know, there are more and more, as CO2 gets bigger, you'll see manufacturers trying to cut and paste a lot more of their equipment, but it doesn't work everywhere. You can't, like I said earlier, you can't just take a booster system and plant it down in South America or Australia and then expect that exact same system or in Canada, and then put it in Canada, or vice versa. Take the one from Canada, the design, and just put it in Australia, in the outback. It's different technology. So that's what he does, is provide a solution for a specific customer. And he said he's getting into the more in the industrial, up to 1.4 megawatts. This was a good one. I learned a lot about, we talked a lot about training, how he trains his team, and how the importance of it, because it's real important for those who are working on CO2 to understand what they're getting into and how the process works. And I really enjoyed this conversation. There was a lot in there. The next one, Matthew Derby. Matthew, he's, he started from the bottom like myself, right from the ground level, apprentice, right, not knowing anything, working his way up, pushing the broom. He said, I remember that. He said, pushing the broom. That was my job for the first 8 or 9 months, pushing a broom. And this is what you have to do sometimes as a technician. So if you're an apprentice out there listening to this, I did it. I had to carry tools, but you know what? I was the best person at carrying tools. If I was pushing that broom, I'm the best person pushing the broom. Making sure you're the best at whatever you do. And when you're doing that, when you're being the best, you're going to grow a lot faster than the rest of the people around you. Because I seen it. I did it. I was working construction when I started out there. And when I got the chance to move cases and tear cases apart, put them together, I learned and I got better and quicker and faster. And then all of a sudden, wow, you're doing a great job. And why don't you start piping? So then I tried my best at piping and then worked my way all the way up to working on the rack, either pulling wires or doing the controls or changing compressors or whatever it was. So whatever you're doing, especially in CO2, like we talked about here, do it better. And that's what he did through his whole career. Now he owns EcoChill, but he talked about the process of his steps on getting to be a business owner. And you can too. Doesn't matter what you do right now. You could be an apprentice, you could be a salesperson, you could be a project manager. But if you want to become that business owner, or if you want to run your own business, this is who you want to learn from, because he did it. He said on there, I was uncomfortable doing a lot of this stuff, figuring out as I go. And to having a bunch of those number ones. First company to put, I think it was a propane cascade system in. First one to do a transcritical booster system in New Zealand. And there was a list of them that he talked about. I can't remember them all. But if you want to be like that, you need to put the hard work in. And I learned a ton about the different types of systems that he worked on over the years and how he got there. Because as a business owner, I'm still learning. You know, I admire that. Someone who is working hard to grow his team. And he even said it. Like, there was a lot of times that they weren't high cash flow. It cost a lot of money to get a new technology. That's the most expensive technology. You know what I mean? But having people that he was working on, I can't remember the one guy's name. Maybe it was Walter. I'll have to ask him again. But really got the idea of like, let's get this natural refrigerant stuff going, and then went with it and didn't turn back when there was hard times, when there was failures, when there was issues. Just kept pushing forward. Just kept pushing forward. And that's what you need to do out there, especially with CO2. We're all learning. We're all growing. And then last week, I think it was last week, no, 2 weeks ago, we had Giacomo Pisano from Doreen. Man, I learned so much from here. I didn't know much about Doreen. I know when I was back at Emerson, they had like a Doreen compressor and then a Copeland compressor beside to see how you can retrofit from a Doreen to a Copeland or whatever. That's really what I knew about it. Over the last year, I started diving in since I wanted to learn more about CO2. I was going on their website, learning a little bit more. But I learned a ton of stuff about this. Their double stage or their two-stage CO2 compressor. Nobody else has that in the world. Two-stage CO2 compressor. So now I can take a low temp gas cooler unit, because they're not condensing units anymore, they're called gas cooler units, and I can use one compressor because it's a double stage or a two-stage compressor. We dove into that external plenum design that they only have. Nobody else has that. What did he say? It reduces discharge temperature, reduces that oil temperature. You know, and then we dove into that, I think it was called a Daniel chart. You know, I still haven't had a chance to look that up, but the CO2 versus the POE oil, POE 805, I think he was talking about. But understanding the viscosity again, this is something that you need to learn. Like this one here, once again, my fingers, I was trying to write down as much as I can while asking and interviewing the guests. And so it's a lot of fun for me. But I also got into superheat. You know, he said that you can have, I believe it was 9K on medium temp, 9K on low temp, which is different than from other manufacturers. But there's a but. Depends on your discharge temperature. It depends on your oil differential pressure check valve. It's kind of like where Ignacio, when we were talking about the FTE and ETE that Bisser gave them, I think, what is it? They qualified them to test it with a different superheat. You know what I mean? So now Kaiser Warren does all the tests and they understand where they can have that superheat depending on this condition, this condition, this condition, this condition, right? Then you can have a different superheat. But this is stuff that you need to learn. I'm learning it. I'm learning because I was always, you know, 20K, 10K, and 20K. Well, you want to be safe, but if you want to be more efficient, and you know, there's different ways. Measuring that oil temperature, the differential pressure, the discharge temperature, all these different little tips and tricks from all these different experts around the world is going to make you better, because there are just so many different things that they come, and you can see the different manufacturers, compressor manufacturers that I work with or talk to, they all have a different point of view. They have all different tips and tricks sharing with you, which was awesome. Last week, I had Timo back on again from Corel, and we dove into their CO2 PRAC. I need to start learning more about the CO2 controls, because I understand CPC somewhat, microthermal somewhat, because I worked on them a lot, you know, and I was in the field working on them. And then when I worked for Emerson for a time, I was playing around with them, with the training units that I have, and just learning, trying to always grow my knowledge, right? But there's so many different control manufacturers out there for CO2 that now I need to start learning about that. So we dove into the PRAC, understanding and how it controls that high pressure valve, you know, the algorithms in there, how it controls the flash tank bypass valve, and just really getting into the algorithms that he talked about, and why that Corel controller, getting into that PRAC 300T, he said, because that's the transcritical one, and those different applications, that it's all integrated into that one controller. You don't have to have a lot of separate controllers. Then we went in with the HECU, the HECU controller. So now that's the gas cooler condenser controller, which is separate from the PRAC, which is more of that booster system. We dove into, and he talked about, you know, how that one, it's going to be another game changer for condensing unit, because condensing unit market for CO2 is going to blow up. It's going to start to grow rapidly. That's what I mean. And you're going to see more and more CO2. I know most of the manufacturers are working on it right now. If they're not there, it's in their R&D works right now. They're putting that in there because CO2 is happening, and it's going to just, I see it is going to continue to rise. And I learned a ton on that one. Once again, always sharing good tips and tricks from Timo. And that is the last 25 weeks. You know, that's a lot of CO2 knowledge, and I hope it is bringing you some value. I hope you learn 1 or 2 things each week. If you learn just one thing each week, that is 25 new things that you learned from the experts from all around the world. And it's not stopping here. I'm going to bring more value. This is what Refrigeration Mentor is all about, is to bring you as much value as possible so you can do the best job that you can and be the best you out there. It's so important to be like that. So the next 3 weeks coming up. So next week, I'm going to have James Bailey from Omega Solutions. We're going to be talking about net zero application using CO2 and hydrocarbons. We're going to be diving into that because net zero is a big thing that's happening out there. And James is an expert at that. And so we're going to dive into where we're seeing net zero with CO2, different application of hydrocarbon. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to have James Darby from RDM. Like I said, I need to start learning about more controls, and I know you guys need to start learning about them as well. So he's the manager for RDM in New Zealand. And so we're going to be diving into different CO2 applications there are. His experience is with, because I need to learn about it. So what do I need to do? Get the experts to come and talk about it. They did it. Let's really ask the good questions to them so they can help us out. And then once again, I'm going to have Philip Walker. That session that we did in August was just, there was so much good information on that flash tank stability. We spent the whole time on that. But we're going to be diving into heat recovery, hot gas defrost session, really what RNEG does with their designs and their systems. Like he even said that they're working in with multi-unit buildings right now. So commercial buildings where they're pushing CO2 up 100, 120 feet to, you know, do heating, do cooling. Super cool information. This stuff is game changing for me because I am learning every time. So I want to thank all of you, every single one of you here today on the Zoom call, every one of you listening on the podcast. I appreciate all of you, all the support, and anything I can do to help you guys out, you let me know. Reach out to me, and I'll do my best. I'd love to go. Anybody has any questions? They want to bounce some ideas off me before I get going here. Okay, so David asked a question earlier. Trevor, the oil management the other day, so that was with Giacomo, there was no mention of compressor losing oil through worn rings. And so if you do have worn rings, doesn't matter if it's an HFC or a CO2 compressor, if you have worn rings, you're going to have a higher oil pump out rate. That's just the way it is. Because you have all that pressure pushing down in it, and it's going to pump out a lot more. Thanks for the CO2 Mondays, Trevor. I've logged on for the last 10 weeks, and it's been worth it every week. Andre, thank you so much. Appreciate the support. We're going to keep doing this. We're going to get as much knowledge out there. Miguel, what do you think about A2L refrigerant? Okay, so I get this question all the time. You know, oh, you talk about CO2. You must be, against synthetic refrigerants. No, they have their place for now, but once again, it's a short-term solution. PFAS, TFAs, all this stuff that I'm hearing more and more about from these different refrigerants, HFO refrigerants. I know it's going to be limited. It's no different. We had CFCs to get refrigeration really started, getting it commercialized to blow it up. Then we had HCFCs, and then we have HFCs, and now we got HFOs, or HFC, HFO mix, and then we got HFOs. Once again, regulations, environment stuff is going to start to work on that, and I believe it's going to be just another period, kind of like 404. And I know customers are tired of it. I've heard of customers, I've talked with customers, said they had 5 gas retrofits in the last 20 years, 25 years. That's crazy amount. Is there going to be a place for it? There's a lot of people that are promoting it, using it, doing it, because one of the things about it is that you can retrofit now a store that's already in place. So that's where we're going to see A2Ls, is that you're going to be able to do a retrofit. That there's still a lot of changes, don't get me wrong, because there's depending on where you're at in the world, there's going to be stipulations. Do you have to have a leak detector in each room? Do you have to have solenoids to shut it off if there's a leak? Depending on the refrigerant and stuff. But it's an easier retrofit for now than doing a CO2 changeout. But I know companies right now, contractors, that are retrofitting from HFC to CO2, and lots of them. So we'll start to see what the cost difference is going from a retrofit to an A2L to a retrofit to a CO2. And we're going to start to see case studies on that coming out. But I say A2Ls is going to be limited. That's my personal opinion. So that's it. That's 25 weeks. This was 26 weeks. We're going to keep going. Hopefully I can keep sharing information, valuable information. If this is a good one for the people that are here. If you have other topics that you want me to talk about that I haven't covered, we haven't covered. If you have guests that you'd like to be on the show, you think would be great to come on, talk about CO2, talk about natural refrigerants, please shoot them my way. Once again, I appreciate the support, and we'll see you at this next CO2 Monday. Have a fantastic day.
Hey, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you got something out of it, something that you can use in your daily life. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up button, hit the subscribe button, and click the bell button, because when you do click the bell button, it will notify you anytime new videos are released. Also, check out the Refrigeration Mentor webpage at refrigerationmentor.com, where I'll have all the different trainings, upcoming events, the different podcasts I've been on, as well as the Refrigeration Mentor podcast. If you want to check that out on Apple, Spotify, Google, any service provider of your choice. Super excited to see you at the next video. Now let's get a conversation going.